Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Dan Rodney and I'm here for Noble Desktop. We're going to be presenting a live stream today for HTML5 animation with GreenSock. And for those of you who are attending live, we have the great benefit of having Jack Doyle, the original creator and founder of GreenSock. He's the genius behind this great JavaScript animation platform. And we also in the chat have Carl Schoof, who also works at GreenSock, and he's an amazing coder, and he's a great trainer, and hangs out in the forums a lot. If you ever have questions and you're on the GreenSock website, you'll probably see tutorials by him and him answering questions in the forum. And so we have the two great guys from GreenSock with us live in the chat today. So if you're here live, definitely take advantage of that. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and ask them. I'm going to be going over GreenSock from a beginner standpoint. This is meant to be introductory, beginner friendly, so if you're not a JavaScript expert, that is fine. Even if you've actually never touched JavaScript, hopefully you'll still be able to get through today. And I want to basically show you how to get started with GreenSock and get started using it, because it's a really awesome tool. So I'm going to be switching over to doing a screen share in just a moment, but just wanted to give a quick little background in case you're not familiar with Noble Desktop. Noble Desktop's been around for 27 years. We're based in New York City, and we teach a lot of people in-person classes in New York City, but we also allow people to live stream into those classes as well. So if you're ever thinking about taking one of our classes, just know that you don't have to come to New York City. You can also do them as a live stream as well. So keep that in mind if you ever want to take any of our classes. It's not just for those living in New York City. But of course, if you're in New York City, we like to see you in person, so you can come down to our training center and we'll see you in class. This is the kind of stuff that we've been teaching, code, design, related technologies, and we teach a lot of people how to create websites, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So GreenSock goes perfectly with the kind of stuff that we teach. So let me do a screen share into my computer, and I've got a presentation here. And this is a web-based presentation. For those of you who are watching this video, you can get this URL in the video description down below the video. For those attending live, I just pasted it also into the live stream chat, so you can get that. But just if you're watching the recording of this, this link is down in the bottom description below the video. And we're going to keep this up, and we're not going to change it, so it'll stay up there, so you don't have to worry about it going down. There's some demo files that I've already downloaded to my computer, but if you want to follow along with any of the files that I'm demonstrating, you can do that. You don't actually have to follow along with those. You can just download them later for your reference if you want to play with them afterwards. And when you're in this presentation, you can just use your arrow keys to go left and right to switch between the presentation. And if you're on a touch screen, you could swipe between these slides as well. And I just have to refresh this page just so you can see the cool animation that the guys over at GreenSock created. I believe Jack created this. The cape flying in the background, waving, and just had to show you that. After a little while it stops, but it's a really cool animation that they did. So what are we going to do today? We're going to give you an overview of GreenSock, tell you what it's all about, show you some examples of animations you can create with GreenSock, things you should know about ad banners, and give you some examples of ad banner animations. I'm going to do some coding and show you how to get started using GreenSock and coding it. Talk about some cool plugins that you can add on that make GreenSock even better. And finally, we'll do kind of a wrap up and synopsis of what we did. So that's the kind of the goal for today. And like I said, it's going to be very beginner friendly. I want to show you the range of capabilities of things you can do with GreenSock, and also give you some basic coding starting concepts so that you can go ahead and start using GreenSock as soon as possible. And then you can always learn more from today going forward. So what exactly is GreenSock? GreenSock is, you know, the company, if you will think of it that way. And the GreenSock animation platform, or GSAP for short, is a JavaScript library that's focused on animation. That's its pure goal, is to let you animate on the web. So it actually got its start back in Flash when people were coding animations in Flash, and in Flash you could do timeline animation, but if you really wanted to take power and control over your animation, in Flash you could do ActionScript. And so GreenSock was an ActionScript library, and people were using it back in the days of Flash. So they, of course, rewrote the whole thing and did it in JavaScript so that we can use it natively in web browsers now that Flash is dead. So GreenSock is going to enable you to create ultra high performance, professional grade HTML5 animation for the modern web. Basically, that means that you're going to create high quality, beautifully playing back animations. So they play at high frame rates, it's not going to be choppy, and you can do it easily and get a great result. The first thing to understand is that GSAP is not an app. It's not something like Flash was, where you launch an app and there's a user interface. It is JavaScript. So you're going to use HTML and CSS to code up a web page, and you're going to use GSAP and potentially some JavaScript to code up the animation. Since GreenSock is a JavaScript library, you can mix any regular plain vanilla JavaScript with GSAP and do whatever you want natively in the browser. But it is coding it. And there's actually a lot of benefits to coding an animation, because with just a couple lines of code, you can do tremendous amounts of animation. And even if you had an interface, sometimes it's easier to code the animation than to use the interface. Like if you want to change 50 characters, manually animating 50 individual characters would be very tedious. But through a single line of code that just says loop over all those 50 characters, you might be able to animate all 50 characters very quickly. So we'll see how this works today, but we're going to be coding some animations. Things you might not know about GSAP that are good to know. It's been around since 2006. As I said, it got its start in Flash, and so people have been using GreenSock for a long time. If you've only recently heard of GSAP or GreenSock, it's been around for a long time, and it's been heavily used by many, many animators out there. So it's not just a new guy on the block that's a new fad that's going to come on and blow up and die away. They've been around for the long haul, and they should hopefully be around for the long haul, because it's a great platform that's well established with a lot of people using it. In fact, over 3 million websites and major companies have used it. Apple just used it on their HomePod webpage, and so it's used by little guys to big guys. Anybody can use it, and by talking about the top brands using it, we're just saying that the people that know, they'll use it, and it doesn't matter whether you're a little guy or a big guy. Anybody can use GSAP, and it works great. The majority of award-winning websites use GSAP. So this was kind of an interesting report that I Hate Tomatoes created, where they took a look at 31 of the top sites from the AWW Awards. And so they looked at these, and they kind of analyzed, like, what do these websites have in common? So all of them use CSS animations in some way. 94% of those websites use JavaScript animations more than CSS animations. So the main predominant type of animation was JavaScript. And 68% of these award-winning websites that heavily use JavaScript animations use GreenSock as their animation platform. So basically a lot of people are using GreenSock, and people that are winning awards are using GreenSock. So you're in good company if you're using GreenSock. And it's universally accepted on every major ad network. And that's good, because if you're going to animate your ad and submit it to a network, you want it to be supported. Not just any JavaScript animation library is supported. What are people saying about it? If you know CSS Tricks, which is one of the most popular web tutorial websites out there, very popular site that most of you should have heard about if you've ever done any sort of coding. Chris Coyer runs a great website with CSS Tricks. It's been around for a long time, and tons of useful information here. And this was a talk about comparing animation technologies, and they had a little thing about GreenSock. And in their words, GreenSock is far and away my favorite library to work with. Please understand this bias comes from working, playing around with, and bumping my head badly on on a lot of different animation tooling. So when I give my strong endorsement, it's through blood, sweat, and tears. So this was written by Sarah Drasner of CSS Tricks, and so this is not GSAP people talking about this. This was not a paid placement. This is somebody who does this, and through her experience, is saying GreenSock is great. And just my own anecdotal experience, I remember when Carl first came to us and showed us GreenSock, because Carl has taught with Noble Desktop for many years, and he used to teach Flash with us in the beginning. That's how we got introduced to Carl, and was a great Flash teacher, and a wonderful guy too. And he said after he left Noble Desktop and started doing some other stuff, including working with GreenSock, he came back and said, hey, I got this cool thing to show you guys. And at the time, we hadn't heard of GreenSock, so he came in and he showed us GreenSock, and I remember just being blown away by the demo. And he wanted to work with us to create a class and a workbook, and I just thought, this looks amazing. Like, the first demo, it had me right away. I'm like, this is the way to go. So that's how I was first introduced to it, and hopefully it'll be as impressive to you today. So why use GSAP? This is a little animation that the great guys over at GreenSock created. So let me just hit rerun here and you can watch this little animation. This was built with GSAP, but also saying why to use it. Performance. Frame rates, the quality of the animation is great. It works well across different browsers. The control that you have, and independent controls where you could do lots of different things at separate times, and the control over what you're doing and when you're doing it is far superior in GSAP than other things like CSS animations. A sense of timeline control that you can pause, play, or rewind animations, and that you can programmatically do this is amazing, and GSAP lets you do that. They probably shouldn't even be saying the new standard for HTML5 animation. It's kind of become the standard for HTML5 animation. Not really so new anymore. Let's take a look at some different examples of websites. So the Hunger Games, popular movie, of course, they built their website in part using GSAP. I'm not sure exactly what all parts they did using GSAP and what they might have used other technologies for, if what was kind of vanilla JavaScript versus what was GSAP. But they have some couple interesting things here that I want to show you. The main thing over here I just wanted to show was this cool little menu sliding in. Let's do that a couple times here. And just watch how all those things kind of slide in. And then when you mouse out, it goes away. So the way that those animate in, you can do that in GSAP so easily. I'm going to actually show you how to animate a bunch of things with a single line of code. And so basically you can write a single line of code that's going to animate all those in one after another. It's a really cool feature that GSAP has that lets you animate those all in. And then you do cool rollover effects and all sorts of interesting things on this website. This was from, as you can see down here in the copyright, 2013. So this is from a while ago, but it's still a cool thing. It's not live on the web anymore. This is like an archived version of this one. So as we mouse around here, they got this cool bouncy effect. It's neat. I can just drag around to see different ones. And whenever I want to see one, I could just click on it, and this thing opens up. And kind of Fruit Ninja style, I could just swipe across it to have that play. Fruit Ninja style swipe site. So just neat little animations all across the place here. And for me, the frame rates of this, that I can pan back and forth so quickly, and the frame rates are so smooth. You know, everything is just slick and smooth and fast and responsive. It's a great example. If you know the movie Now You Can See Me, now they have a movie Now You Can See Me 2. Well, they've had it for a while. It's been out. So they did their movie site. And if you know anything about movie sites, I mean, it's a big movie. So they can spend a lot of money and time on development. And this is just a crazy website. So first of all, if I just mouse around, this is cool kind of perspective. And then as I scroll here, just using my two-finger drag on my touchpad here on my laptop, the closer you are, the less you see. So this is kind of a really cool mirror effect, and I can scroll backwards or scroll forwards. It's almost a little dizzying if you go too fast. And so they scroll through each person, introducing them. I have a little thing over here on the right if you want to learn more about them. And then the rain starts pouring down, and then it reverses and goes back up. And then it all goes into a teardrop. And then when you're in here, you can actually move your mouse around and change the perspective as you're scrolling. Just kind of crazy. And then when you're all done, it goes back to the beginning, and you can basically kind of loop through this. All right, the next Rembrandt. Watch the animation of these characters as they come in. That was just a slick little text animation. I love that. Then as I scroll down, again, things animate in kind of one after another. So there's a sequence, there's a timing, there's a thing that happens, and then another thing that happens, and another thing that happens. And that's something that when you have a lot of timed things like that in CSS animation, CSS animations are kind of fine for short little things, but the more things you have involved, the harder it is to manage all of that with CSS animations. So then we can keep scrolling, and they go to different areas, kind of talk about different things. And there's some interesting little parts of this interface that, for example, this little eye with the circle, when I mouse over, that circle becomes a square. And so using SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, you can morph from one shape to another one. And that's something that GSAP lets you do, is actually morph from one shape to another using GSAP. Over here, you can learn more. This is a video that happens to be playing over here. So cool little site there. Bose. I'm sure you've heard of Bose headphones and speakers. And so you can mouse over these different areas. And then watch all the subtle little animations of things animating in as we switch. So like all the different lines come in and out. And all these subtle little animations just make a fluid, smooth experience that's just nicer than it just, boom, just popping in and appearing. It's more subtle, higher end, just cooler looking. Here's a web designer's portfolio. This cool kind of particle effect here going on in the background, but watch as I click View Portfolio here. Some more cool SVG animations going on here. Let's open up this menu over here on the top left, though. And there's a couple things going on, like the lines, they rotate, but also these 4 items. And I know there's only 4 items, but they each come in slightly delayed, one after the other. I know it's kind of quick, but there's a big difference between something just appearing and something kind of building in. And you don't want to waste people's time. You want it to be quick and efficient, but having things kind of build in and having a transition just makes for a really interesting effect rather than something just, boom, just popping in and appearing. One more example here. a Firefox loading animation. I just love the kind of simple kind of storytelling that does. Let me hit refresh and just show that one more time here. Really cool, subtle little thing. It's not the Firefox website. This is Nerdmanship is he made this cool example of taking the Firefox website and saying, hey, what if we wanted to animate this? Now, the interesting thing is he actually goes through and explains here that this probably wouldn't be an actual good thing to launch on the Firefox website, because as far as utility goes, if you want to download Firefox, you really just want to get to the website and click the download button. And in this particular case, it actually has to build in. You have to wait. It doesn't show the button right away. And so you have to think about when you want to use animations, and you can tell a story in a very interesting way when it makes sense. But do keep in mind that if people want just kind of a utility type of thing, that maybe that's not the time to use animation in that particular instance. So you have to think about when to use it. And of course, today we're going to be talking about how to use it, but with power comes great responsibility. So when should you animate things? That there's a whole art to that. And you can look at more examples here. There's a link to Nerdmanship's code pens, and you can check those out more. And GreenSock has a whole showcase of different websites. For example, Apple's HomePod site that they just launched, that also uses GreenSock. So bunches more examples if you want to see some stuff. But that kind of gives you an idea of the range of capabilities that GSAP can do. A lot of stuff. Now, that was all website stuff. What about doing ads? Basically, Flash is dead. Adobe is not making it for mobile devices, and even on the desktop, Macs do not ship with Flash pre-installed. You'd have to actually go and download Flash if you want it. So there's a lot of people nowadays that are not having Flash installed on their computers, and Adobe's not going to continue developing the Flash plugin and adding a bunch of new features probably, because for the most part, since it doesn't work on mobile, it's kind of a dead format now. Plugins of any type, and it's not just Flash, but just basically plugins in general, have died off, and things that are native to the web is what won out. And Google stopped accepting Flash ads back on June 30th. If you want to read an article, you can click on that for the article, but you cannot submit Flash ads to Google. So you have to switch to something else. And you could do something like an animated GIF if you want something very, very simple. But if you want anything that has a lot of animation and high frame rates and high quality appearance that's not limited to 256 colors, you can't really use animated GIFs for higher end, super high quality animation. Animated GIFs are just meant for very simple little animations. And they're fine if you just want to create something simple and quick, and if it's easy, then an animated GIF might be fine. But if you want to create anything that's nicer quality, high frame rates, lots of things animating, you want millions of colors, you want high res graphics, you can create something that can download fast and perform well using GreenSock. So the good news is that GreenSock is an industry standard within the ad networks. And here's a bunch of different ad networks, and they actually exclude GSAP from the file size calculation of your ad. So when you're submitting an ad, of course you have a certain file size limit, because your advertisers don't want you to put a 1 megabyte advertisement necessarily, or a 5 megabyte advertisement on their website, slowing their website down too much. So they put file size limits, and GSAP does not count against that file size limitation. So, and they actually have GSAP hosted on a content delivery network. So they allow GSAP, they exclude it from their file size calculation, and they actually host it. And if you want to read more about that, GreenSock's website has a great article about that, and that's where I actually grabbed that. That little chart there is down here where they talk about it. And so you can read all about it. And if you're loading GSAP from an ad network, they'll typically have a link where you can grab it from their CDN instead of grabbing it directly from GreenSock. So let's take a look at a couple ads. Don't worry about the white of the page, just focus on the ad here. The idea is that this ad would be placed into some part of a website. So all sorts of things going on in that ad. And here's two different ads for the same kind of topic, the world of tanks. You could not do something like this with an animated GIF. You know, it's too many colors, the frame rate's too high. Animated GIFs just couldn't handle that. Not to mention that you can do interactive things. You're using JavaScript here, so you can use GreenSock with any JavaScript that you want to, just plain vanilla JavaScript that works in a browser. So here's an interactive thing where I'm actually using my mouse. Oh, yeah, let me just hit refresh here. I'm using my mouse here, and I could just click to shoot, and it's an interactive thing. I can actually go in there and I can shoot and do things, and you could do any kind of interactivity here. There's a button when I mouse over it, it changes. You can use any JavaScript that you want. Here's a video of some more examples. I'm going to go full screen in this. They do switch right after one's done, they switch right to the next example. But here's one that Google had. There's an ad for Jeep. You know, so if you're just looking for the kinds of things that you can do with GSAP, imagine even though these are ads, you could do any of this stuff for websites, for ads. It doesn't really matter. You're just doing it at different sizes. Here's one for Verizon Fios. The idea here is that there's just so much variety of things you can do. You can do things from simple to complex. Things can have text, they can have photos, they can have vector graphics with SVG, scalable vector graphics. Anything that you can do in a web page, you can animate with GreenSock. There's another McDonald's thing. In Google's rich media gallery, they give some examples as well. Of course, Google's huge advertising company, so you could submit your ads to Google. So they're just showing some examples. There we go. All right, so now we're going to get to a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of how do you go about starting to use GreenSock or GSAP, the GreenSock animation platform. First thing to understand is that it's modular in that you can load only what you need, and that's specifically designed that way so that you can keep your file size small. And that can be important for ad networks where you don't want to load code that you're not using. So there's kind of two main components, if you want to think of them as the two primary components, and then there's other things you can add to those. But there's tweening and timelining, essentially. So when you're tweening, tween comes from in between. So when you're animating something, you create basically kind of, if you think about it mentally, maybe like a keyframe at the first part, a keyframe at the end, and you want your animation tool to create the in-between parts. So you give it a start, you give it an end, and you want the animation to figure out what comes in between. So tweening is from in between. So the timeline part comes from if you think about a timeline, and this could be a literal virtual, like kind of an actual timeline in an app. If you think about like After Effects or how Flash was, that there's a timeline, but you don't need a visual timeline to have the sense of a timeline. A timeline is timing control. When you have a timeline, whether it's a virtual one that you don't see, or whether it's in an app, one that you actually see, a timeline gives you a sense of when things happen. So the timing of it. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. So it's a sequence. It's like a storyboard. You want this, and then this, and then this, and then that to happen in this order. Maybe you want some things to overlap. Maybe you want some delay between things. And so the timing of that all comes from timeline. So we're tweening things, and we're using a sense of a timeline. So there's light versions of both of those, and there's max versions of both of those. The light versions load less functionality, and the max versions load more functionality. So if you just need the basic functionality, you can load the light ones, and it's going to be a smaller file size. If you need more functionality, you can load the max ones, which will be a bit of a bigger file size. And for the detailed differences between these, you can click on this, and the GreenSock documentation is amazing. They have so many examples and so much information on their website. It's such a great resource, so you should definitely be checking it out. I have a lot of links to varieties of resources within the GreenSock website in this presentation. But basically, this goes through the different things that are here in Tween Light, so you can see what you can do with it. And then if you look at Tween Max, just to compare, it's everything that is in Tween Light, but additional things. So there's extra features here that you can see that are in there, and some more. And so if you need any of those features, then you bump up to Tween Max. If you don't need Tween Max's features, then you can use Tween Light. Same thing with Timeline Light and Timeline Max. You can click on those to see more information. So Timeline Max includes everything of Timeline Light plus additional things. Depending on what you need, you load just those files. There's also extra plugins, and we'll talk more about plugins at the end. You can load plugins based on your needs. If you don't need a plugin, you don't load that code. Again, to try to keep the file size as small as possible so that your web page can load as fast as possible. Another really important thing in animation is doing easing. And so GreenSock has very powerful easing. And when you're animating something, for example, let's say we do a bounce ease. As you're moving something, if it were just going to go in a linear fashion from start to finish, it would just move. Even Steven, just moving along in a linear speed. It doesn't go faster or slower, it just moves at one rate of speed. The power 1 versus the power 2 versus the power 3 is just ramping up the amount of easing that's being done. The concept of easing comes from, hey, let's go easy at a certain part. So where do you want to go easy? In or out? So in is the start of your animation, and out is the end of your animation. So if you want to ease into the animation, it's going to go slowly as it gets started and then ramp up the speed towards the end. So it goes slowly, then speeds up. So a power 1 has just a little bit of slowness at the beginning. So there's not as dramatic a change in your speed. A power 4 is more powerful, so it's a more powerful effect. But you can do things like back, where it's going to go and it's going to actually pull back before it goes into the animation. Or if you're doing that on the out, it'll actually overshoot the target and then come back. So that's the idea of the back, is it goes a little too far and then comes back. Or in the beginning, it starts, comes back a little bit, and then shoots through. And that kind of anticipation is very natural for a lot of things in real life. Like if you're going to end on something, for it to overshoot a little bit and then come back, like, oh wait, I couldn't quite slow down fast enough. Let me go back to where I'm supposed to be. You can create some cool effects. You could do bouncing, boing, boing. So you could just do one animation that creates that bounce by just doing a bounce ease. And it's interesting, in CSS, you can't actually do a bounce ease. CSS easing is more limited than something like GreenSock's easing. So you can do basically just simple eases with CSS animation. And a very powerful thing is you can actually do custom easing. So you can actually go in there and specifically control exactly. So if you want to start out with something like, for example, a power 3 and then customize it, you can get exactly the easing that you want. And so powerful to be able to do that. And that they have the editor and everything for you. Super powerful. So those things can all be done, and basically you start out with something simple and use that if you need it, and if you need more powerful things, you load those. So with that said, let me get started showing you how to do some code. These are the files that were in the beginning of the presentation, and I've already downloaded them here. I've already put into here a link to the GSAP library, but I do need to show you how to get that. So first thing you're going to want to do is head over to GreenSock, and you need to load in their JavaScript library. So click download, and you have a variety of ways that you can get this. You can actually download a zip of the actual files should you want them, and I've already actually done that here on my desktop. I have the GreenSock.js folder that I just downloaded today. There's some documentation, some getting started, and then your source files. If you actually want to read through the code, you can read through the uncompressed versions, but on a website that you're going to actually deploy, you can use the minified versions, which are smaller, faster to download. And so in here are the different files that you might be linking to depending on your needs. So you've got your timeline light, your timeline max, and your tween light, and your tween max. So if you want to put these into your website and link to your local asset and then upload it to your web server, you can do that. Or the other thing you can also do is to use the content delivery network link that they give you. And there's some advantages to using a content delivery network to deliver this file, because if you use that and all the other people on the web are using it, users might already have GreenSock cached in their browser. So if somebody goes to two different websites and both of those websites use this same link from this same website, this Cloudflare content delivery network, then it doesn't have to re-download it on the second website. It only has to download it on the first. So performance is great. When you have a content delivery network, it helps to deliver content to a lot of people. So they're kind of built for delivery, and it can help with caching. So you can also just grab this link, which that's how I did it in our examples. I just grabbed the link there, so we're pulling it right from this GreenSock content delivery network. Now you can choose down here what you want to include. Right now you can see this is giving me tween max with the robust setting. If I click lightweight, it's giving me tween light and a couple other things which we'll talk about in just a moment. I'm going to click customize so you can see here. For example, if I check on tween light, like let's say I start with robust. Oh, actually, that doesn't change anything here when I come to customize. So I'll just go to customize here. If you're doing tween light, that's much smaller. If you check on tween max, notice all the other things that are grayed out. That implies that they're part of tween max. So tween max is including all those other things like the CSS plugin. That's an important plugin because we often use GreenSock to animate some CSS attribute. The width or height or the position of something, things that we normally style with CSS, GreenSock is animating those CSS properties using JavaScript. And so there's a CSS plugin that allows you to do that. So tween max includes all that sort of stuff. If you're just getting something like tween light and you want the CSS plugin, you got to check that on. And that was actually part of the lightweight option that was here. It gives you tween light, also gives you the easing, and it gives you the CSS plugin as well. So if you want to see just exactly what you're going to get, you can decide what you want to get there, and it'll give you the appropriate links, like so. All right, so that's how you get it, and now we can actually go about coding this. All right. I'm going to open this up in my code editor. It doesn't matter what code editor you work with. You can work with any code editor. I happen to be using Sublime Text, but you can use Atom or Dreamweaver or Notepad++ or whatever code editor that you want. But this is just an HTML file. I'm going to assume that you understand that an HTML file and CSS is how you create a web page. And I'm not going to go into that side of things. I'm going to be focusing on GreenSock today. Let's open up this page in my browser. I'm going to open this up in Chrome. So here's the web page that I created, just a very simple web page with just a few elements. Specifically, this HTML5 logo. Let me go back to my code here. So right here is that image. If I delete the image, save it, come back and hit refresh, Notice the image disappears. So that's the image. The H1 is a heading 1 for the fun with animation. If I delete that, save my file, and come back, notice that the fun with animation text is gone. Let me bring that back. So that's that text. And notice the star in the background. That is this div right here. I'm just going to delete that. And notice the star is disappeared. So those are the 3 different elements that I have there in this web page. The logo, the star, and the text. And this is just normal HTML elements that you would have in a web page. And you can style them to put them together however you want. In this case, I have it as kind of a scalable, flexible page. Like so. All right. So how do we get started? Well, the first thing is putting in that link to the content delivery network. So that I just grabbed from the GreenSock website and pasted it into my code here. Notice where I'm putting this. So if we have the body of the web page, right? And then here's the end of the body. I'm putting this, all this JavaScript at the end of the page so that I know that everything in the page is already loaded. And that way everything's ready. All my objects are there so that when I start to animate them, I know that they're loaded and I won't get any JavaScript errors saying that that object does not exist yet. So do this right before the end of your body tag. Okay. And if you didn't want to put the link to the content delivery network, if you wanted to link to your local file, then you would just be changing the source to the local file instead. So this loads in the ability to use GreenSock. Then you're going to write your JavaScript in a script tag, and I'm just going to keep it in this document. If you want to put it into a separate JavaScript file and link to it, that is perfectly fine and very common, but I'm just animating things in this page, so we're going to keep it simple and just put it in this page. I've written a lot of the code just so I don't have to type everything out from scratch, and what I've done is I've commented out. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, if you want to comment something so the code does not execute in the browser, in JavaScript, you put // So if I delete the // that uncomments the code, and now that code will actually execute in the web browser. Depending on the app that you're using, you might be able to use a keystroke to do that. For example, in Sublime Text, I can use toggle comment to toggle comments on and off. And since I have a lot of comments here in my code, I'm going to be using that keystroke. On the Mac, it's Command/, and on Windows, I believe it's Control/. So I'm going to do the Command/ to uncomment this out. Actually, let's start right here. I'm going to make this bigger just to make sure everybody can see this well. So just to make it easy, I've loaded TweenMax, which is going to basically load all the functionality that we're going to need. And later on, we'll see if you don't need as much functionality, how you can load in something less, so you get a smaller file size. But for right now, I wasn't concerned about file size. I just wanted to demonstrate things. So I loaded in TweenMax. Since I have TweenMax, and maybe I'm not sure in the beginning what features I might be using, you can always start with TweenMax, and later if you decide you don't need the full TweenMax, you can always go down to something like TweenLite. The basic syntax of GreenSock is to say, hey, TweenMax. This calls in the ability to do certain things, to animate something to a certain appearance. So when you're animating something, the first thing you have to tell it is what you want to animate, the target element. So what do you want to animate? Secondly, how long do you want that animation to take? Do you want it to take a half second, a tenth of a second, 10 seconds? So what do you want to animate? How long do you want it to animate? And then what do you want to actually animate? All the different variables that you might want to change over time. And in this case, it's going to animate to whatever variables you set. Okay, so let me comment that out and do our first line of GSAP code. So we're going to say TweenMax animate to an opacity of 0. So you put all these variables in the curly brackets, and in the parentheses, you're putting all 3 of these different things. So the first thing is your target. The second thing is your time that you're going to take to animate it. And the third thing is what you're going to animate. What are you going to change over that 1 second of time? So in here, in quotes, we're putting in the selector. Now this is, if you're familiar with CSS, this should look just like CSS. You're putting in a CSS selector like logo. Now, if you're using a hashtag, that would be an ID of logo. If you're using a period, that would be a class of logo. In this case, I have an image with a class of logo, and so that's why we're putting period logo. Same as we would in CSS, much like you do in jQuery. Now, this does not require jQuery. I'm not loading jQuery, and so it works fine with jQuery, but it does not require jQuery to operate. So I'm going to say animate the logo to an opacity of 0 over 1 second. I'm going to save that, come back to my browser, and hit refresh. Let's hit refresh again. So starting with its initial look, it takes 1 second to animate to an opacity of 0. Pretty cool. Now, you probably don't want things to fade away. You probably want things to fade in. So instead of going to an opacity, you probably want to come from an opacity. So that's another thing that you can do using tween max. Instead of going to something, you can come from something. We're still going to take that logo. We're going to tell it to take 1 second, and it's coming from an opacity of 0. So the only difference between these two lines of code is the from. That's it. So we're going to save and hit refresh again. So in this case, it starts off invisible, and then it takes a second to fade in. So you can have multiple things fade in if you want. We'll get to that in just a moment. But let's move on to the next thing. And I'm just hitting the keystroke here to toggle the comment. I don't even have to highlight the whole line. In this case, I could just click into it, and I'm just hitting the keystroke, and it either comments it or uncomments it. And again, whatever is commented out, that code does not execute. Only the lines that are uncommented are going to be executed. So in here, it's just exactly like this line of code right here, except instead of doing opacity, we're doing scale. Now, scale goes from 0 to 1. Right now, I'm doing a scale of 0.5. So this is just like CSS when you're doing scaling. 0 to 1 is 0 to 100%. So if you do 0.5, that's like saying scale 50%. You can say 0.5 if you prefer. You don't need the 0, so you can just say 0.5. I'll save that, come back, and hit refresh. So now it's scaling from a scale of 0.5. I can make this coming from 0, save that, and hit refresh. Now it's scaling from nothing. If I just wanted to come up just a little bit, I could say 0.9. And it's just scaling just a little teeny bit in that case. Keep in mind that when you're doing from, this is giving it basically a starting point. It's going to start from this appearance. And then what is it going to end up with? It's however the page would normally look. So let me just comment this out for a moment. You want to build your page to be how you want it to end up looking when you're doing a from animation. And so you build it the way you want it to end, and then you're telling it, hey, let's start from this other appearance, and it will start looking that way and end the way you built your web page. Okay. I'm going to comment that out and move on to doing multiple elements. So we want to animate all 3 elements. Let's take and animate from a scale of 0 for the logo. We'll take 1 second to do that. Let's refresh the page. So we're scaling up the logo from a scale of 0. Now let's do a second element. Okay. We're going to tell the background. Notice that's dot background, which means that I have an element with a class of background. Take 1 second to animate. And then in this case, notice I have more than one variable. We can change the opacity and the scale, and we can tell it to wait for just a moment. Now, if we don't have a delay, let me just cut that out for just a second, save and reload this. Notice that the background, which is that star, is animating at the same exact time as the logo. So they're both scaling in exactly at the same time. Well, one of the variables that you can add, and you're just putting commas between the different variables, and it doesn't matter the order that you're putting these in either. If you want to put scale and then opacity, that's fine. Doesn't matter. We can say, hey, let's delay this animation, just this particular one, just background. Let's delay that by 1 second. And since the first one takes 1 second, and then the delay of this one is 1 second, it will complete background after the logo has finished. So the logo animates, and then the background animates. Let's uncomment this one. Then we'll take the heading. We're going to animate from an opacity of 0, from a scale of 2. Now, so a scale of 2, that would be 200%. So now we're going to start big, and we're going to end the current size, like the final size. So instead of scaling up, we're going to scale down. And then we're going to delay 2 seconds. Now, this is from the beginning of the animation. So if this takes 1 second, and that takes a second, that's 2 seconds. So by delaying this one 2 seconds, it will happen after both other things have completed. Logo, background, and then heading. Let's do that again. Logo, background, and then heading. So you can see that the heading scales down from a scale of 2, which would be 200%, down to the current size, which would be like a 100%. So in this case, if I want there to be maybe some overlap between things, maybe I want the background and the heading to come in at the same time, I could just have the same delay. They'll both be offset 1 second from the start of the animation. So they'll happen at the same time. Save that and hit reload. The background and the heading animate at the same time, and they finish at the same time. If you're just having a few things, this might be fine, but as you start to coordinate a lot of different things and change timing, trying to figure out when things should happen can be rather challenging when you have a lot of things. So while you can do this, there's a great concept in GreenSock called a timeline, where you can use a timeline to create a sequence of things. This really isn't an official sequence. It's not that one thing happens after another per se. Like, I never said specifically, hey, do this right after this. I just happen to put a delay that makes it happen right after it. But they're not relative to each other. They're relative to the start of the animation. I can just happen to coordinate it. That just happens to start after the previous one. But for example, if I reorder this code, if I cut this and paste it, and I put a delay of 2 seconds, all of them are still based on the original time when the animation starts. So they're still going to do the logo, then the background, and then the heading. It doesn't matter that the heading was done second in the code, because the delay of 2 seconds is from the start of the animation. Okay. So the other approach that you can take, instead of just throwing these all into tween max, let's comment all these lines of code out here, is instead you can use a timeline. Now, to use a timeline, we're going to use timeline. And you can use timeline max or timeline light, depending on your needs. We're just going to start with timeline max, just so that we have all features available should we need them. And we have to create some sort of variable. You can name it whatever you want. You can call it my timeline, or sometimes people just say TL for short. But this name is a name that you can come up with. You can create different timelines and name them differently. Just a variable that you're giving a name. And we're creating a new timeline object in our timeline variable. So this creates a timeline that we can add things into. By itself, it doesn't do anything visually. You don't see it. You come back, you refresh the browser. Timeline isn't a visual thing that you see. It's just in code, I now have a place that I can put things in a sequential order. So now, instead of targeting tween max, I'm now going to be putting things into the timeline, whereas before I put it into tween max. That's the only difference between something like this line of code and this line of code, is instead of putting it into tween max, I'm putting it into the timeline that I created as a new timeline. But otherwise, this syntax is all exactly the same. That we're going to say, hey, tell the logo to do, in this case, we sped it up a half second. So 0.5 would be half second, scale from 0. So we're scaling that up in a half second. Now, the next line of code that I'm doing is, again, putting it into the timeline. So I keep putting it into the timeline instead of tween max. Let's put the heading. Let's take a half second to animate that in from a big scale so it shrinks down as it comes in. In this case, notice I did not have to put a delay, but yet it does the logo and then the heading. That is because I have a timeline. Whatever you put into the timeline first happens first, and then whatever you put in second happens second. So in this case, the order does matter. Logo and then heading. Logo and then heading. If I rearrange these, if I move this up, now it's heading and then logo. Heading and then logo. So just by reordering the code, you can reorder the sequence of your animation. So that's pretty powerful. Let me just hit a keystroke here to swap those lines of code back. And let's add a third thing. So because I'm doing this in order in a timeline, you got the first thing, then the second, and then the third. Notice there's no delays on any of this. Simply by putting them into a timeline, it'll do the first one. When that's done, it'll do the second. And when that's done, it will do the third. 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. Logo, heading, background. Logo, heading, background. It does it in that order because that's the order we did it in the timeline. So that is amazingly powerful, and we're going to see some more features that can do in just a moment. But we're about halfway through our session today, so we'd like to take a 5-minute stretch break, restroom break, if you need it. I'm going to put up a timer here so we don't lose track of time. So go grab a drink, use the restroom, whatever you need. In 5 minutes, we'll continue. All right. So just based on a question in the chat, and if you were watching the video back, you might have wondered why I was getting this URL here. There was just a question in the chat, can you have things overlap when you're doing a timeline? So I just introduced the timeline, but there is a position parameter where you can specify when something happens in relationship to other things. So this link right here, greensock.com/position parameter, talks all about this. Another parameter that you can add into here where you control when something happens. You can have things play at the same time. So if you want two things to play at the same time, you can do that. If you want them to play relative to the beginning of the timeline, you can do that. If you want them to have extra time between them or to overlap somehow between them, all of those things are very highly controllable, and you can do all of that. And we're just going to scratch the surface of what's possible with GreenSock today, but you can have total control over that. But the basic idea of a timeline is, unless you do something with the position parameter, is that they happen one after the other. The position parameter lets you change that behavior. All right, so now I'm going to go in and comment that out and switch over here to this example where I've added in some easing. So let me go back to the easing visualizer that I went to earlier and talk about how to use the easing visualizer. So if you want something to do a specific ease that's already pre-made, you can go here to say bounce. You want something to bounce, right? You do want to choose whether you want something to start bouncing as you go into the animation or at the end of the animation, or both. You can have it bounce at the beginning and bounce at the end. Let's say I want to bounce at the end of the animation. So I'm going to do an ease out. So it'll end by bouncing. Here we go. This gives you the little bit of code. In this case, they're just giving you an example that they're just moving it vertically because Y, you've got X and Y. Y change would be moving it vertically. An X change would be moving it horizontally. So this ease right here, you could just copy that in and paste it here as another variable. So that's exactly the same code. I literally just copied that and pasted it into here. So in this case, we're going to take the logo and let me just comment these things out. So we create a timeline. We tell the logo to take 1 second, coming from a scale of 0, and we're going to be easing with a bounce on the out. So let's see that. Boom, boom, boom. It's kind of like it's coming and hitting my screen with a little bounce, bounce, bounce. Pretty cool. Now, if I wanted to do an ease in, all it does is switch the out to an in. So I could copy and paste that here if I want to, or I can just come back here and say ease in. Come back and refresh the page. Now it does a bounce at the beginning. Not the effect I was going for. I like the ease out better. Also, another little thing that you might not notice right away about the ease visualizer here is if you click on the name, they have a list of different eases that you can do. And I actually wanted to mention this to Jack and Carl because there used to be easing graphs here, and probably some update or something you did to the website recently broke those little easing graphs. So hopefully by the time you guys watch this video back, if you're watching this as a recording, this will be fixed. But they used to have really nice visual graphs. So you could see basically what you're seeing here. Like you could see the power 3, you could see the bounce, and you could get that if you click on the name down here, that you kind of visually see them all. And so I think just probably a website update or something accidentally broke that. And yep, Jack Doyle just said he'll fix it. So great. So that's a neat little trick, because if you're thinking like, hey, how did Expo look? Like you don't have to click through each and every one of these. If you click on the name down here, you just click on it, and then you get an overview of visuals, and it's really nice to be able to see those visuals if you're a visual person like myself. Okay, so let's go down. So I'm not going to bother adding an easing to the background, but the heading will do a back ease. Now let's take a look at the back ease for a moment. So if you're doing back ease, and I'm going to do this on the out. So at the end of the animation, it goes a little too far. Now, how far does it go? So this is actually something you can configure down here. You click on the name, the number, and you can switch the number. Now that's nice here in the visualizer, so you can see that a higher number goes further, so it kind of overshoots and has to come even further back. If you go with a smaller number, then it doesn't overshoot it quite as much. Now I know that they have this little menu right here, which is a couple presets. You can customize this in code to be whatever you want. They just put in a couple things for you to visualize it so you get the basic idea. But that is why there's a config option, because it's a configurable amount that you can put on. So in this case, we have a config of 4, but you could do whatever you want. If you want to do 3.5, you could do that. And so that does the bounce. And then watch the heading at the bottom. It goes boing. And see how it gets really, really small, and then it comes back. So because we're animating scale from 2, which is 200%, and we're going to 100%, it ends up going further than that. So it actually goes smaller than 100%, and then it has to go back to the end size. So it has to go back to 100. So it basically goes from 200. It does hit 100, but it keeps going, and maybe it goes to like 80, and then it has to go back to the 100. And the higher this number, the smaller it's going to get, because it's going to overshoot that scaling even more. If you go with something like 1.4, you're going to get less of a back, like less of that bounce on that text. And the higher that number, if you go with something like 4, the more a bounce, because it's going to overshoot it by an even greater amount. So it's a more exaggerated effect. So there's a lot of power in this easing that you can do. All right, so that's our first little demo right there. And now let's move on to the second one. All right. So here, a few things are coming through. And actually, let me open this up in Chrome so I can keep coming back to refresh. So that slides out, and that slides up. Actually, the background here does fade in really quick. So that fades in, that comes out, and then that comes out. So let's take a quick look at how this is done by opening that up in my code editor. So we've got, in this case, we have IDs instead of classes, just so we could show you both examples. We have a background, we have a logo, we have an address. And in my page, this is the background, this is the logo, and this is the address. And the final part down here is what we call content. So all those are IDs, but they could be classes if you want them to be classes. It doesn't really matter. Now, in this case, instead of loading tween max, we chose to load only what we needed. We didn't need as much, so we chose to go with a slightly smaller file size. And so we only loaded in tween light and the ease pack and the CSS plugin. And essentially, that is like going to the GreenSock website, clicking download, and going with the lightweight option. They give you those 3 things. Okay, so this will download faster than tween max. If you don't need the functionality, don't waste people time downloading functionality they don't need. We only have 4 things. So in this case, we decided, hey, let's just see how do we create this if we're not using a timeline. We're going to go back to tween light. I know the first example we showed tween max, but now we're using tween light, so we'll do tween light. Let's take the background, which now is a hashtag instead of a dot, because it's an ID instead of a class. We're going to come from an opacity of 0 to make it fade in. We'll take 1 second to do that. Let's just comment these all out. So we fade that in. Now the other elements are all still there because we haven't done anything to animate them. So we're just fading in the background there. Then we take the logo, and we take 1 second to come from an X. Now, if you're doing X, that's a left to right movement. And so if you do a positive number, that's coming from over here. And if you do a negative number, that's coming from over there. So it's coming from the opposite direction. We're also doing a rotation. Again, if you do a positive rotation, it's going to give a certain twist. If you do a negative rotation, it's going to give you the opposite twist. We're also doing a scale, and we're doing ease back at the end. We're waiting 1 second so that it happens after this is done. So the background happens, and then the logo happens. And then we bring in the address. In this case, we did an X of 100. That's a positive number, so it comes from the right. And we faded it in, again, with a little ease. And we wait 2 seconds because each of these takes a second. So now we're at a total of 2. That happens, then that happens, and then that happens. Because we're not using a timeline, we have to figure out how much of a delay if we don't want there to be overlap. If we want there to be overlap, we can do less. And then this will start coming out now when this is still finishing animating. So now there's going to be a little bit of an overlap between those. And that would be fine. And then finally, the content comes from an opacity of 0 and a Y, which is a vertical position move, and it waits 3 seconds, so after the other ones are done. So then that's the final thing that happens. And that moves up. If we did a negative amount on the Y, then that would move down instead of up. There you go. Now, the only thing is, if you want to start moving things around, again, the timeline is not, the timeline is going to give you more control. So when you don't have a timeline, if you want to start adjusting this and speeding it all up, let's say you want to make that 0.5 seconds and that 0.5 seconds, well, now really this delay would need to be changed, and then this delay would need to be changed, and it just makes it harder to do. Plus, if I just simply want to speed everything up, I actually have to go to every single one of them to speed it up. Whereas if I have a timeline, I could just say, play the timeline faster. So we have a lot more control with the timeline. If you're just doing a few simple things, it might be fine to do it this way. But let's show you the power of the timeline with a bit more than we learned the first time. All right. So here now I am loading in not only tween light, but timeline light. I didn't need the full timeline ability. The basic timeline light is enough for me. I don't need timeline max in this case. So the tweening lets me animate, and the timeline lets me put it into a timeline. Just to switch things up, notice I'm just using TL for the name of my timeline because, again, that's a name that I'm just coming up with on my own. I'm going to create a new timeline with it. Before I called it timeline. Now I'm just calling it TL for short. The other thing that I happen to notice that somebody had mentioned this into the chat is you don't actually have to write in timeline or TL, whatever your name is, on every single line if you don't want to. You could just have it on the first one, so you're putting it into that timeline, and then you could just leave it off for all the subsequent lines. Just saves some more code. Just in case you want to change the name of it, you only have to change it twice. So that's pretty cool. And basically we're doing the same thing we did before, except there's no delays that we have to figure out. And because we're doing this, and then this, and then this, and then this in a timeline, they will happen one after the other. So let's open that up in Chrome. So they happen one after the other with no delays. They happen exactly after the previous one finished. Now here's the really cool part about this. Because this is a timeline, you can change the time scale, it's basically the speed of your animation. Let's make it 3 times faster. It happens a lot faster now. If we just want to speed it up twice the speed, we can use time scale 2. Now it'll happen twice as fast. It's amazing with one line of code that we could just make everything happen faster. So if you create this great animation and the client's like, I like it, just make it just a little bit faster. You could come in here, and the time scale of 1 would be the normal time scale. You obviously don't need that line of code if you're doing a time scale 1. But if you're like, hey, make it a little faster, you could just make it a time scale 1.2. And then it's just a little bit faster. They're like, hey, speed up just a little bit more. You could go to 1.5 or something. Yeah, actually, let's try 15 just to see. Oh man, that happened so fast we can barely see it. Yeah, let's try something like 6. 6 times faster, really fast. But seriously here, to be able to just make something a little bit faster without having to go back in and individually adjust all of your different timings, is super powerful. And also, if you just want to play something back when you're developing, this can be really great for developers to just watch their whole thing back just faster, so you don't have to wait through it in real time, and you can still kind of get a sense of everything that's going on. And then maybe at the end, then you just delete that line of code. But just as a developer, it can be useful for you as well. So if we hadn't made a timeline, we wouldn't have that ability to do the timescale on it. All right. So even if you're doing a simple little thing, it's possible you might want to use a timeline to have more control. But if you are just animating a couple things, you could just get away with timeline. The tween light, and just if you really just want to keep things simple and fast to download, you don't have to use a timeline. It all depends on how complex your needs are. So our final example here that we want to do is a stagger animation, and this is where I love the stagger animation that they're doing here. Okay, so here we've got, notice that each line, each one is coming in, one after the other. Now, we just did a very simple fade in. We're going to get more complex and make this look even more interesting, but each line is fading in. Now, to keep things simple, we made these as different paragraphs here in the code. Just so you know, there's a plugin that's amazing that they made, which is called Split Text, where if you just give it GSAP a paragraph or a line or whatever, you give it some text, you can split it into lines, you can split it into characters, you can split it into words, you can split it however you want, and GSAP will actually go in and it will wrap tags around each of those items, and then you can address the different pieces, so you don't have to actually split things up yourself. GSAP can do the splitting, and then you can animate based on what it's split up. I'll give you some examples. I'll show you that later. I have that in my presentation. So just to keep it simple though, so we didn't need to use a plugin or anything here, I just made different paragraphs in our wrapper. So those are the only paragraphs. So just to keep things simple for this, we're just going to target all paragraphs. Normally we wouldn't target all of them, but that just makes this demo simple. So we've loaded in TweenMax in this case. In this case, we just went back to loading TweenMax because it was just easier just to load in all the capabilities. And because we're not doing a bunch of different things, we're just going to animate one thing in this example. We're just going to put it in TweenMax. We don't have to create a timeline. And we're going to use stagger from. So stagger from is really very much like the from animation, but it takes an additional parameter. We still have the target, we still have the length of the animation, we still have the variables, but there is a fourth thing that we do in the stagger from, which is how much to stagger apart the animations. So each thing should stagger by a certain amount of time. You don't want them all to have you don't want them all to start at the same time. You want them to be offset by like a 0.1 second or a 0.2 seconds, so that they stagger in one after the other. So let's take all the paragraphs, take 1 second, animate from, because it's a stagger from, opacity of 0, and then this is the new additional option here. It's just another comma, 0.1. So take 0.1 seconds, and it'll do the first paragraph the first time through. Then it will wait 0.1 seconds and then do the second paragraph, and then wait 0.1 seconds and then do the second, and it'll just loop over every paragraph in this case and animate them. So 0.1 seconds apart, the first one fades in, and then the second, and then the third, and so on and so on. Let me comment that one out and do a different one. In this case, same concept, but instead of waiting a second to do that animation, and second's kind of a long time for an animation to operate on, we'll just have it take 0.2 seconds to fade in and zoom up from a scale of 0.5. We're still offsetting it by 0.1 seconds. So that animation itself only takes 0.2 seconds. It takes 0.2 seconds to animate from a smaller size and an opacity of 0. Now, if you want these things to take longer, of course, you could say, hey, take a second to do that animation. So it's taking much longer to animate. It's still offsetting it by 0.1 seconds. Now, if you wanted to offset it by 1 second, The first one comes in, then the second. So now there's no overlap because the length of time that my animation takes and my stagger amount are exactly the same. So it's literally like I see one thing and then the next and the next. But that I can do that in one line of code is amazing. One line of code to animate all those things in. If I want overlap, then you simply make your stagger amount less than your duration. Then there's going to be an overlap. Then you'll see multiple items at the same time. If you make your stagger amount longer than your animation, then there's actually going to be some space in between each of those animations. So it's going to wait 2 seconds before moving on to the next thing. It's only taken 1 second to animate. So it's going to see the animation come in, then it's going to wait a second. The next thing animates in, waits a second, then the next thing animates in, it waits another second. So you can really do a lot of stuff with this stagger animation. This was the thing that when Carl showed me stagger, I was like, oh my goodness, that isn't, that I can do that in one line of code just blew me away. You had me at stagger. Let's do an opacity, a scale, and a Y. So we're doing the same thing we just did there, but we're adding a Y, which will be a vertical position move. Ooh, there we go. Now you could do a negative amount or a positive amount. So instead of moving down, now it moves up. Do-do-do, do-do-do. So now if you start to go back and you think to some of those examples that we saw of things moving in, and what if I wanted to do an X? Right, and then we could do a negative amount on that. So now you go back and you think to some of those examples and how I talked about things sliding in. That's how they did it. One line of code to do that. So powerful that you can do that in just one line of code. And then the final example here, we're coming from an opacity to 0, from a 50% scale. We're doing a vertical move, and we throw a little easing in at the same time. You got to add your own little sound effects there. It's cool animation that you can tweak all this stuff with just tweaking that one line of code. You want things to happen a little faster, like the total animation here, like maybe 0.1 seconds is a little too long. You want it to happen even faster. So now they're going to be offset by even less. Bam, bam, like rapid fire, super quick. It's amazing that you can do that. So let's go back here to my presentation. So plugins. I mentioned a couple things about plugins. They add functionality to the core features of GreenSock. So I mentioned split text. Let me rerun this. You can split based on characters. So here they're doing a tween on each individual character. So let me do it again. Pretty crazy. It's a stagger from being done to the different characters. But you could do it to words. Maybe you want to do something to words instead of characters. You could do it to lines. So you can have things animate in lines. Or you could have it do all of them and do separate things based on characters, words, or lines. You could do any of the stuff. And so they're going in with the split text plugin and actually adding the HTML that needs to be done in live in the browser so that you can then go in and manipulate those things. So that's an awesome, awesome plugin that you can learn more about here. Super, super powerful. Great plugin that they make there. Draw SVG. So if you're not familiar with SVG, SVG is Scalable Vector Graphics. And it basically allows you to do vector graphics in your browser. You can create these SVG files in Sketch or in Adobe Illustrator or in any kind of vector tool that allows you to export as the SVG format. Inkscape is a free one if you don't have Illustrator or Sketch. So any decent vector drawing tool should give you the ability to export as an SVG file. And then you take these SVG files into your page, and you can use GreenSock to animate those just like you would other HTML elements, because SVG is a native HTML5 element. So you can put SVG code right into your HTML page and animate it using GSAP as well. So this specific plugin, the Draw SVG, is so that you can do this cool drawing effect. If you just want to animate SVG, all the things we've been learning so far with regular GSAP also applies to vector objects as well, as long as that SVG code is in your page. But if you want to draw it like this and kind of create these cool animations where it looks like it's being drawn, there's a great plugin that they make for that. That's just one specific effect with SVG. Another effect is morphing. So here, let's just actually rewind and play this. All these different shapes are morphing and changing from one to the other. And if you remember some of the examples, like the Raphael painting one, I think, or no, it was Rembrandt. The Rembrandt painting one, they morphed from a square to a circle, or I think it was a circle to a square. And that was just a simple example of a morph. But to be able to morph things is pretty darn powerful. You can create all sorts of cool little effects. So, here they're just showing that you can morph from any shape to any shape. But it could be as simple as going from a circle to a square. And you can create some really interesting effects. And that's another plugin that you can get for GSAP. So their core strength is that this stuff just works. It's got great browser support, and it excels at complex storytelling animations. The more things you have, the more you're going to need something like GreenSock's timeline ability. To compare it to CSS animations, you can do CSS animations, but the amount of control you have with CSS animations is not nearly as powerful as GreenSock. The whole concept of the timelining that they have and the control that you have within that, GreenSock is far superior compared to CSS animations. If you're just doing a quick little thing, CSS animation could do that, but the more complex it gets, the more you need GSAP to do that. It also solves a bunch of real-world problems revolving around SVG. There can be cross-browser issues with animating them, prefixing. So when you're animating different elements, some browsers require certain vendor prefixes for certain CSS attributes. They take care of that, so you don't have to worry about changing all of those properties over time. Like if you were doing a CSS animation, you'd have to worry about vendor prefixing. GSAP takes care of that. But the workflow stuff, that might be one of the aside from them making sure that it works everywhere, the things that they've thought about for workflow is really important. For example, with the timeline, you can say to jump to 10 seconds into the timeline. And if you've completed your first 10 seconds of animation and you're focusing on the next 10 seconds, to have to rewatch the first 10 seconds of your animation over and over and over again, every single time you waste 10 more seconds. And that can add up to minutes and minutes upon minutes throughout the day. But with GSAP, you could just put in a line of code that says jump to this point in time, and you can skip over that first part. And so you don't have to waste your time about that. You can change the speed of your animation very easily, so you can slow it down and really get a sense of exactly what's going on. So in terms of working with GSAP, there's a lot of great things that they've done, very smart things that make our workflow easier. It's not dependent on anything. You can work with jQuery, but you do not need to load jQuery. So it plays nicely with others, but it doesn't need others to work. Their documentation and support is awesome. Carl is often in the forums answering questions. They post so many tutorials, so many great code examples. Their documentation is extensive, tons of great information there, and definitely check that out. And they are a funded project. And so they have a great amount of information on their website about why funding is important. And the short answer is the reason that it's good to be funded is you know that it's going to be maintained and maintained well. Unfortunately, sometimes with open source projects, if there's nobody willing to give their free time, unfortunately, sometimes open source projects can be abandoned. And it's not to say, open source is bad, but open source is not always a great thing. That if you have a funded project that has steady income coming in, you know that the people care about their product, are going to continue to improve it, and they're going to be there for years to come. Like I said, GSAP's been around since 2006, so that is 11 years they've been around. So they're here to stay, and that's great because we know that we can rely on them. So licensing. So now you might be thinking, hey, wait, how are they funded? Where are they making their money? So essentially, the core tools are free, unless you're charging people to access your website, your app, etc. And the charging for access is the key there. So if you're making money off of a project, that's not necessarily the issue. If you're developing a website for somebody, you could be making money charging them to develop and to design the website. That's not going to be why you pay GreenSock. The website that you develop for them, do they charge people to access that website? If they charge people to access that website, for example, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, if they charge people to access their content, then they would need to get a license. But if it's completely free and they don't charge memberships or anything, they could still make money on the website. They can still have ads running on the site, but as long as it's free for people to access, then GSAP is free. If you are charging for access to your website or your app, let's say you make a web app and you put it on the store and you're charging people for it, in those cases, you need a Club GreenSock membership. You can watch a video on this if you want to. They have a couple different plans depending on what you need, but it starts at $50 a year. You can compare exactly what you get here as part of it. And one of the other benefits of getting a Club GreenSock membership is to get access to some of the plugins. So for example, the Morph SVG, the split text, you need the Shockingly Green membership to get access to some of those additional plugins. So some plugins are free, some are not. So split text, which is a great plugin, the Morph SVG, which is a great plugin, those you have to get the Shockingly Green, which is the $99 per year. So if you want the plugins or you're charging for access to your site, in those cases, you would need to get a membership. They have lots of information about licensing information. And if you purchase your Club GreenSock membership, then you get the bonus plugins such as the split text, the draw SVG, the morph SVG, that type of stuff. Cool thing, if you take the Noble Desktop class, so we offer a class for people to come to New York City and take it in person, or you can also do it online. So if you're not in the New York area, you can't make it into our class, that's fine. You could do a live stream online, and we use GoToMeeting for that, so people can screen share into the instructor's computer, watch the demonstrations, hear them on a microphone. If there's any questions or issues, we can talk about them, and you can even do a screen share back to the students' monitor, so we can take a look, and if they're having coding issues or anything, we can take a look at that. So anywhere you are, you can take our GreenSock class. The only thing is it's not a it's a live event, so you do have to attend during the hours of the class. So we're on Eastern time, New York time. So if it's a day class from 9 to 4:30, 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., that is New York Eastern time. But if you take that class, whether it's online or in person, you receive a free year of the Shockingly Green Club membership. So that's worth $99 if you take our class. And if you've already paid for it, then they give you an extra year. They just extend your membership, but you get a free year. And so if it's the first time you're getting into GreenSock, then you start off with the free 1-year membership. And so then you get those plugins as part of that, which is awesome. And then you can even use that on sites that charge for access, so you're covered for that first year. Okay. So, like I said, we do have a a class and a book as well. So if you take a look at the class, this talks about the class, gives some other examples. The next class we have coming up is October 19th and 20th from 9 to 4:30 New York time. Like I said, you could do it live in person, or you can do a live stream online. And it comes with a workbook. If you're doing it as an online person, we send you the eBook version of it, so you can download the eBook. And if you don't want to go through the class, if you can't attend the class, if you don't want to wait for the class, the book is also another great way to learn. These are step-by-step exercises that the amazing Carl here, who's on the live stream today in the chat, he worked with us to create this book. So we did some of the writing, he came up with the projects and the code, and we worked together to create this great book. And it's step-by-step, walks you through the process, tells you, open up this file, type in this code, and literally walks you through learning so many features. Starts out with the basics and goes much further than we've gone in today. And so the ebook's $49. You can download that right away and get started. If you want a print version of that, $65. And that's another option to taking the class. If you want both, you can get the print and ebook for $75. So those are ways that you can continue your learning. There's a lot more to GreenSock than we could cover today. I just wanted to kind of get you started and show you the basics, but it's capable of so much more than what I showed you today. But hopefully this was an inspiration to kind of get you excited to want to learn more and show you that GreenSock is a pretty amazing tool. I'm going to open up the chat to some questions. I know that there have been some talk in the chat, and I think Jack and Carl have already been answering a bunch of those questions, but I'll give people another couple minutes to chime in if they have any other additional questions. If you're heading out, I just want to say thanks again. Hope to see you in a future online live stream. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We will be sending out links to this video as soon as it's posted. Also, if you subscribe to the channel, you get notifications when videos are posted. All right, looks like the chat is kind of quiet. Looks like a lot of people are already asking their questions, so I will wrap this up. I'll hang out in the chat for a little bit longer, but as far as the live stream video sharing goes, just want to say thanks so much. Thanks for Carl and Jack of GreenSock for joining us in the chat today. It's one of the benefits if you attend live sometimes. You get to ask questions and talk to people in the chat. But definitely hope you enjoy using GreenSock. I think it's a great tool. It has changed the way that I think about animating things on the web. And if you want to learn more, the class or the book, either one is a great way to learn more. And hopefully we'll see you around in the future. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.